September 1943, at Rabaul Airfield, Japanese pilots stood at the peak of their confidence, believing they had already mastered the skies after nearly 2 years of unstoppable victories across the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most respected fighter pilots, read an intelligence report describing a new American aircraft called the Hellcat, and instead of laughter, he reacted with laughter because the specifications sounded completely wrong. According to the report, the Hellcat was almost twice as heavy as the Zero, larger in size, and built with armor and extra equipment, which to Japanese pilots meant it would be slow, clumsy, and easy to defeat in combat. At that time, Japanese air strategy was based on one core belief: a lighter and more maneuverable aircraft would always defeat a heavier one, and the Zero perfectly represented that philosophy with its unmatched turning ability and long range. For years, this belief had been proven correct, as Japanese pilots achieved incredible kill ratios in places like Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, destroying enemy aircraft with minimal losses of their own. The Zero felt almost like an extension of the pilot's body, allowing them to outmaneuver any opponent. And this created a dangerous level of confidence where Japanese pilots began to underestimate any new enemy technology. However, what they failed to understand was that the Zero's incredible performance came at a hidden cost. Because it lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and pilot protection, meaning even a few bullets could destroy it instantly. Despite this weakness, Japanese pilots ignored the risk because their enemies had not yet developed a system capable of exploiting it, which reinforced their belief that skill alone would always guarantee victory. Meanwhile, the Americans were not trying to copy the Zero, but instead were designing a completely different kind of fighter that focused on power, durability, and teamwork rather than pure maneuverability. The Hellcat was built with a powerful engine, heavy armor, 6 machine guns, and advanced communication systems, making it part of a larger combat strategy rather than just a single aircraft. When Japanese intelligence first reported these features, commanders dismissed them as proof that Americans did not understand aerial combat, assuming that such a heavy aircraft would never be able to compete with the agile Zero in a traditional dogfight. This overconfidence created a critical blind spot because Japanese pilots continued to train and fight using the same turning-based tactics, unaware that the nature of air combat was about to change completely. The first real encounter between the Zero and the Hellcat shocked Japanese pilots, as the American aircraft refused to engage in turning fights and instead used its superior speed and power to climb, dive, and attack from positions of advantage. Instead of chasing the Zero, the Hellcat attacked like a predator, striking quickly with overwhelming firepower and then climbing away before the Japanese pilot could respond, making traditional tactics useless. This new style of fighting, known as energy combat, completely disrupted Japanese strategy, as their aircraft could not match the Hellcat's power at higher altitudes or recover speed quickly enough after maneuvers. For the first time in the war, Japanese pilots experienced a situation where their skill was not enough to save them, because they were no longer fighting individual pilots, but an entire system designed for maximum efficiency. The realization came too late, as more Hellcats began appearing in larger numbers, each one supported by radar guidance, coordinated tactics, and better trained pilots who worked together instead of fighting alone. What started as laughter at an intelligence report slowly turned to confusion, then fear, as Japanese pilots began to understand that they were facing something entirely different from anything they had encountered before. By the end of 1943, the balance of power in the Pacific skies had begun to shift, marking the beginning of a devastating transformation that would eventually destroy Japan's air superiority completely.
The turning point began in late 1943, when Japanese pilots started encountering the Hellcat more frequently and realized that this aircraft did not behave like anything they had fought before. During one of the early encounters near Marcus Island, a Japanese pilot spotted several incoming aircraft and initially mistook them for bombers because of their large size and heavy appearance. Confident in his Zero's superiority, he dived toward the enemy, expecting an easy victory, believing the heavier American aircraft would struggle to react quickly. However, instead of turning or fleeing, the Hellcat suddenly climbed upward with surprising speed, using its powerful engine to gain altitude in a way that completely shocked the Japanese pilot. As the Zero tried to follow, it began to lose speed and struggle against gravity, revealing a critical weakness when fighting in vertical maneuvers rather than horizontal turns. Within seconds, the situation reversed and the Hellcat repositioned itself above the Zero, turning from prey into predator in a way Japanese pilots had never experienced before. The American fighter then opened fire with 6 heavy machine guns, unleashing a volume of bullets far greater than anything the Japanese were used to facing in air combat. The Zero, lacking armor protection, was extremely vulnerable to this kind of firepower, and even a short burst could cause severe damage or destroy the aircraft entirely. Many Japanese pilots who survived these encounters reported that their planes were torn apart within seconds, leaving them with little chance to escape or counterattack. This marked the first realization that the Hellcat was not designed to compete in turning battles, but instead to dominate through speed, power, and positioning. Shortly after, during attacks on Wake Island, larger formations of Hellcats demonstrated a new kind of coordinated fighting style that further confused Japanese pilots. Instead of breaking formation and engaging individually, the Hellcats maintained discipline, flying in organized groups that supported each other during combat. When Japanese Zeros attempted to attack using traditional diving tactics, the Hellcats absorbed the initial attacks with their armor and continued flying without significant damage. Once the Japanese pilots lost their speed and positioning after their attack runs, the Hellcats counterattacked with devastating efficiency. They used their weight and engine power to climb rapidly, gaining altitude where the Zero's engine performance dropped significantly for lack of power at higher levels. From above, the Hellcats would dive down at high speed, fire a burst, and then climb back up again, repeating the process without ever giving the Zero a chance to engage properly. This method of fighting allowed the Americans to control the battle completely, choosing when to attack and when to disengage, something the Japanese pilots were not trained to handle. In one such engagement, multiple Japanese aircraft were shot down without a single Hellcat being lost, a result that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Reports from surviving Japanese pilots began to describe these encounters not as battles, but as one-sided attacks where they felt helpless against a superior system. The concept of air combat itself was changing, as the traditional idea of turning fights and individual skill was being replaced by coordinated tactics and energy management.
Japanese commanders initially struggled to understand these changes and continued to believe that their pilots could adapt using their existing skills and experience. However, the reality was far more dangerous because the Hellcat was not just an improved aircraft, but part of a completely new approach to warfare that combined technology, training, and teamwork.
American pilots used radios to communicate constantly during combat, allowing them to coordinate attacks, warn each other of danger, and maintain formation discipline.
Roger, breaking right.
In contrast, many Japanese pilots operated with limited or no radio communication, relying on visual signals and individual decision-making, which made coordination extremely difficult. This difference meant that while Japanese pilots fought as individuals, the Americans fought as a unified system, multiplying their effectiveness in every engagement. As these encounters increased, the psychological impact on Japanese pilots became more noticeable, as confidence slowly turned into uncertainty and fear. Pilots who once believed they were invincible now faced an enemy that they could not outmaneuver, outrun, or outgun in most situations. The skies that once felt like a place of dominance were now becoming dangerous and unpredictable, with Hellcats appearing from unexpected directions and attacking with precision. By the end of 1943, it was becoming clear that the balance of power was shifting, and the Japanese Air Force was no longer in control of the skies. What had started as laughter at a heavy and flawed aircraft was now turning into a growing realization that they had underestimated something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. And this was only the beginning, because the true scale of destruction had not yet arrived.
By early 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a new phase where the skies were no longer contested evenly, but increasingly dominated by American forces equipped with Hellcats. Japanese commanders still believed that their experienced pilots could regain control, but they were now facing a reality where skill alone was no longer enough to survive. The introduction of radar-guided interception gave American forces a major advantage, allowing them to detect incoming Japanese aircraft from long distances and prepare perfectly timed responses. This meant that Japanese pilots were often intercepted before they even saw the enemy, creating a terrifying situation where attacks came without warning. Many survivors described these encounters as fighting an invisible enemy, where Hellcats appeared suddenly from above with perfect positioning and overwhelming speed. At the same time, the quality of Japanese pilots was declining rapidly as experienced veterans were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Before the war, Japanese pilots underwent intense training, often accumulating hundreds of flight hours before entering combat. But by 1944, new pilots were being rushed into battle with minimal training, sometimes with only basic flight experience and very little combat preparation. Fuel shortages and resource limitations forced Japan to cut training programs, reducing gunnery practice, formation flying, and advanced combat skills. As a result, inexperienced pilots were sent into battles against highly trained American aviators who had better equipment, better coordination, and far more practice. This growing imbalance reached its peak during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a battle that would later be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan launched hundreds of aircraft from their carriers in an attempt to strike the American fleet, hoping to deliver a decisive blow and regain control of the war. However, American radar detected the incoming waves long before they reached their targets, allowing Hellcat pilots to position themselves at ideal altitudes and angles. As the Japanese formations approached, they were met by large groups of Hellcats waiting in the sky like a defensive wall. The American pilots had the advantage of altitude, sunlight positioning, and coordination, giving them complete control over the engagement before it even began. When the battle started, it quickly became one-sided, as Hellcats used their energy tactics to dive, attack, and climb repeatedly without exposing themselves to danger. Japanese pilots attempted to engage using traditional turning tactics, but these efforts failed because the Hellcats simply refused to fight on those terms. Instead, the Americans attacked from above, fired powerful bursts, and then climbed away before the Japanese could respond, leaving them vulnerable and confused. Within minutes, dozens of Japanese aircraft were shot down, many without ever getting a clear shot at the enemy. The scale of destruction was overwhelming, as entire formations were broken apart and destroyed in a matter of minutes. American pilots reported that shooting down enemy aircraft became almost routine, as targets appeared one after another with little resistance. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost hundreds of aircraft, along with many of their remaining experienced pilots, dealing a devastating blow to their air power. In contrast, American losses were minimal, highlighting the massive gap in effectiveness between the two sides. The battle earned the nickname Turkey Shoot because American pilots compared it to hunting defenseless targets, emphasizing how one-sided the engagement had become. For Japan, this battle marked a turning point, as it destroyed much of their remaining carrier-based air force and left them unable to compete effectively in future engagements. The psychological impact was just as severe as the physical losses, as surviving pilots realized that they were no longer fighting a fair battle. Many described the experience as being hunted rather than fighting, as Hellcats controlled every aspect of the engagement with precision and coordination. Even the most skilled Japanese pilots found themselves unable to overcome these disadvantages, as they were outmatched in nearly every aspect of modern air combat. As losses continued to mount, Japanese leadership faced a difficult truth. They could no longer achieve victory through conventional means. The dominance of the Hellcat had fundamentally changed the war, making it clear that Japan was losing control not just of the skies, but the entire conflict. And as this realization set in, desperation began to replace strategy, leading to decisions that would define the final phase of the war.
By late 1944, the situation for Japan had become critical, as their air power was no longer capable of defending their fleet or challenging American dominance in the skies. The loss of experienced pilots during previous battles created a severe shortage, forcing Japan to send poorly trained young pilots into combat against highly skilled American aviators. Many of these new pilots had only a fraction of the training their predecessors received, often lacking real combat experience and confidence in their abilities. At the same time, American forces continued to improve their tactics using radar guidance, coordinated formations, and advanced aircraft like the Hellcat to maintain complete control of the battlefield. Japanese pilots increasingly found themselves intercepted before they reached their targets, unable to avoid engagements or escape once attacked. The gap between the two sides had become so large that even basic survival in combat was becoming unlikely for Japanese aviators. In major operations such as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, this imbalance was clearly visible, as small groups of Hellcats were able to engage and defeat much larger Japanese formations. In one notable engagement, a handful of American fighters intercepted a significantly larger Japanese force and managed to shoot down multiple aircraft without suffering any losses. These encounters demonstrated that the outcome of battles was no longer determined by numbers alone, but by the effectiveness of tactics, coordination, and technology. For Japanese leadership, the situation presented a harsh reality. Conventional air combat was no longer a viable option for achieving success. Faced with this crisis, they turned to a strategy born out of desperation rather than strength, a strategy that would become known as the Kamikaze. The idea behind the Kamikaze program was simple but devastating, turning aircraft into guided weapons by having pilots deliberately crash into enemy ships. This approach reflected a shift in thinking, where survival was no longer expected, and the value of a mission was measured by its potential impact rather than the pilot's return. Many of the pilots assigned to these missions were very young, often with minimal training and little understanding of what they were about to face. They were told that their sacrifice would protect their homeland and change the course of the war, giving meaning to a situation that offered few other options. However, even within this strategy, the dominance of the Hellcat remained a major obstacle, as American fighters intercepted many kamikaze aircraft before they could reach their targets. Hellcat pilots developed new tactics specifically designed to counter these attacks, intercepting incoming aircraft at distance and destroying them before they became a threat. In operations such as the Okinawa campaign, this defensive role became critical, as large numbers of kamikaze aircraft were launched in waves against the American fleet. Despite the intensity of these attacks, a significant percentage of kamikaze planes were shot down by Hellcats before they could complete their missions. This further demonstrated the effectiveness of American air superiority, as even desperate measures struggled to overcome the advantages provided by technology and coordination. For Japanese pilots, the psychological impact of this situation was overwhelming, as they faced an enemy that they could neither defeat nor escape from. Some described a sense of inevitability in combat, where encountering Hellcats meant that survival was largely a matter of chance rather than skill. The concept of fighting with honor began to conflict with the reality of modern warfare, where survival required strategies that went against traditional beliefs. Even experienced pilots who had once dominated the skies now found themselves struggling to adapt to a completely different kind of battle. The transformation of Japanese air power from an elite fighting force into a desperate defensive effort marked a significant turning point in the war. By early 1945, the situation had reached a point where Japan could no longer sustain effective air operations, as resources, training, and experienced personnel had all been severely depleted. The skies that once symbolized strength and dominance had now become a place of constant danger and loss. American forces, supported by Hellcats and other advanced aircraft, maintained control over key areas, limiting Japan's ability to respond effectively. This imbalance ensured that any remaining resistance would be temporary, as the outcome of the war was becoming increasingly clear. What had begun as confidence and superiority had now transformed into desperation and survival, marking the final stage of Japan's air war. And as the conflict approached its end, the true cost of these changes would become impossible to ignore.
By mid-1945, the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer uncertain, as Japan's air power had been almost completely destroyed and its remaining forces were struggling to survive. The number of experienced Japanese pilots had dropped to an extremely low level, leaving only a small group of veterans surrounded by inexperienced and undertrained replacements. Aircraft production continued, but without skilled pilots to operate them effectively, these machines could no longer influence the course of the war. In contrast, the United States continued to produce large numbers of aircraft, including the Hellcat, supported by a system of training, logistics, and industrial strength that Japan could not match. The difference between the two sides was no longer just about aircraft performance, but about the ability to sustain and support an entire war effort over time.
For Japanese pilots who had survived, the war had become a completely different experience from what it had been in the beginning. What once felt like a test of skill and honor had turned into a struggle for survival against an enemy that operated with overwhelming efficiency. Many of these pilots began to understand that they were not simply being defeated by better aircraft, but by a more advanced system of warfare that combined technology, coordination, and production. When the war finally came to an end in August 1945, the surrender of Japan marked not only a military defeat, but also the collapse of the ideas that had shaped its approach to air combat. At airfields across Japan, the remaining pilots gathered in silence, reflecting on everything they had experienced and lost during the war. Some of them had once laughed at the idea of a heavy American fighter, believing it represented weakness and poor design. Now they understood that those extra features, armor, firepower, communication systems, had been the key to its success. The Hellcat was not just a fighter aircraft, but a representation of a different philosophy, combining engineering, production, and tactical doctrine into a single effective system. American pilots, supported by this system, were able to fight more efficiently, coordinate better, and sustain fewer losses, giving them a decisive advantage in the long run. When American forces arrived in Japan after the surrender, Hellcats landed on captured airfields, giving Japanese personnel their first close look at the aircraft they had feared for so long. Many were surprised by its size and construction, realizing that what they had once dismissed as weakness was actually a carefully designed strength. American pilots demonstrated the capabilities of the Hellcat, performing maneuvers and showing its durability in ways that left Japanese observers shocked. They saw an aircraft that could absorb damage, maintain performance, and continue fighting in conditions that would have destroyed the Zero instantly. For the designers of the Zero, this moment was particularly significant as they studied the Hellcat and recognized the limitations of their own design philosophy. They realized that while the Zero had been ideal for the early stages of the war, it had not been built to adapt to the changing demands of modern combat. The Hellcat, on the other hand, represented a forward-looking approach, combining engineering, production, and tactical doctrine into a single effective system. In the years after the war, both American and Japanese veterans reflected on these differences, often agreeing that the Hellcat had played a decisive role in determining the outcome of the air war in the Pacific. Some Japanese pilots acknowledged that while the Zero was a superior aircraft in terms of maneuverability, it was ultimately outmatched by the overall effectiveness of the Hellcat system. This realization highlighted a deeper truth about modern warfare, where victory is not determined by a single factor, but by the integration of multiple elements working together. The story of the Hellcat and the Zero became an example of how technological advancement, industrial capacity, and strategic thinking can reshape the balance of power. It showed that relying solely on past success and traditional methods can create vulnerabilities when facing an evolving and adaptive opponent. For those who had lived through the conflict, this lesson came at a great cost, as thousands of pilots lost their lives during the transition from one era of warfare to another. In the end, the laughter that once greeted the Hellcat was replaced by a deeper understanding of what it truly represented. It was not just an aircraft that defeated another aircraft, but a system that overcame an entire way of thinking about war. The skies of the Pacific, once dominated by the Zero, had become a place where a new kind of warfare emerged and proved its superiority. And for the pilots who witnessed this transformation, the memory of that change remained as a powerful reminder of how quickly confidence can turn into realization. The story ends not with victory or defeat alone, but with the understanding that in modern conflict, adaptation is the key to survival. Those who fail to adapt, no matter how strong they once were, eventually fall behind. And in this case, the Hellcat did not just win the war in the sky. It changed the future of air combat forever.